Good morning. I want to thank you again for spending time with me this morning, going through another lesson together. We've been doing this for quite a number of weeks now, and I don't know about you, but it would be really nice to get back to the church and have these lessons in our usual format. You know, have the opportunity to have discussion with you and speak with you after the lessons and have that community together with you. And I don't know if you heard the news, but it sounds like there's a possibility we will be getting back to church next week. So what encouraging news. I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like. I'm guessing details will come in the next little while, but this very well could be the last Sunday school lesson that I present to you in this format, which is exciting. So I do want to take some time to go through something new today. We went through a series on anxiety over the last number of lessons. We don't really have time to go through another series of lessons, so I thought I would just, in the next little while, present a lesson that stands on its own about a topic that hopefully is of interest to you. And the reason I'm going to bring up this particular topic is due to a conversation I had with one of you at I think it was probably in fall. It was the very beginning of the Sunday school year. And I had asked the group what some of the topics were that you wanted us to cover. And this was a topic that one of you wanted us to discuss and talk about, but maybe not something that was going to be presented as a larger lesson. I could have broadened the theme perhaps and talked about it in a broader lesson, but it really works well as a lesson that stands on its own. So today we're going to talk about, we're going to be in Revelation, and we're going to talk about the idea of the New Jerusalem. And I remember not too long ago, somebody asked me what the lesson was going to be on today, and I told them, and they thought that's a really good idea. I have no idea what New Jerusalem means or what that reference refers to. So I hope this is relevant and of interest to you. If you have your Bibles, turn to the book of Revelation, and we'll get going from there. Now, before we actually start reading some of the passages in Revelation, I'm curious, how many of you are guilty of looking at the back or the end of your novel before you start reading it? Or perhaps you're introduced to the characters and you really want to find out what happens, so you turn to the end of the book to see. And I know that some of you are guilty of it, even if you don't want to admit it. Some of you are guilty of this, looking at the ending and spoiling it, I guess we could say. Now, there's a lot of, in novels or in the stories that we read, there's a lot of emphasis placed on the ending of that novel. We want a satisfying conclusion. And for that reason, some of us maybe turn to the end of the book to find out what happens. Isn't it interesting then that in the story of the Bible, in the story of that God has presented to us in the Bible, the story of life, isn't it interesting how rarely we look at the very end of the Bible? There's oftentimes we look at the book of Revelation, but I would argue that there's very few times we look at the book of Revelation and we look at the very last few chapters of the book of Revelation. Usually we're discussing the warning to the churches, because it could be something that we as a church can learn from. Oftentimes we talk about the judgments and tribulations and so on, because it's the images presented are very interesting, the throne of God, these types of things. But very rarely do we look at the very end of the book of Revelation. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at the end of the story. So hopefully you have some familiarity with the beginning, and I'm not spoiling it for you, as looking at the end first. So we're going to talk about, first of all, where this term New Jerusalem, where we find that in the Bible, what are the specific references, and then we'll talk about what it looks like, what it is, and then at the very end we'll discuss the significance of this idea of the New Jerusalem. So you can turn with me to Revelation. We're going to be mostly in Revelation 21, but also a little bit in Revelation 20 and 22. Revelation 22 being the last book the last chapter in the entire Bible. So I'll give you a very brief, the quickest, shortest Cole's Notes of Revelation you've ever heard. to provide you maybe with a little bit of context before we talk about the concept of this New Jerusalem. So the Revelation, the book of Revelation, is a series of vision, or a vision given by God to the Apostle John, and often we get this term apocalypse, and apocalypse simply means a revelation or a vision, and in this case it's a revelation or a vision of the end of times, which is a term that we see in the Bible. The first part of the book outlines a series of judgments, I guess you could say, on the various churches around Asia Minor. These are the churches that had sprung up. This is the early church, so some of the original churches that were planted by the apostles. There's warnings for these specific churches. The next part of the book, Revelation 5 to about 17, and once again, this is very brief, and I'm trying to do this quickly, so forgive me. Yes, I'm glossing over a lot of detail, but Revelation 5 to 17 is a series of judgments. We have the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 scrolls, and the 7 bowls. So these are all just a series of judgments that are put on the world. But there's a story about a dragon and beasts that are let loose on the earth, and this is what we commonly refer to as the tribulation period. And obviously there's all sorts of writing and discussion about what the tribulation is going to look like, but this is that tribulation period that maybe you've heard of before or you've studied. At the end of this tribulation period, the culmination of this tribulation period, we have this, we're presented with what we commonly hear as Armageddon. So the end of this tribulation period, the end of this is Armageddon. It's the Battle of Armageddon. So this is where Satan is defeated at the Battle of Armageddon, and he is bound and thrown in a pit for 1,000 years. And in this 1,000 years, there is peace on earth. This is called the Millennial Kingdom. There's peace and prosperity and so on. And then after this 1,000 years, in Revelation 20, we see that Satan is released from the pit, and he's bound no more. He once again goes on the earth and he deceives the nations, and he raises up, talks about going to the 4 corners of the earth. He raises up these various kings and armies that surround the holy city, Jerusalem. God once again comes down, burns them with fire, and the city is saved. Following Satan's final defeat, this is where we get the description of the dead rising up. So those that have passed away throughout history, they are raised, and the book of life is opened, and people are judged. And this is often referred to as the Great White Throne Judgment, the final judgment. And it's after this, all of these events have taken place. So the tribulation, the Battle of Armageddon, Satan cast down, the 1,000-year millennial kingdom, Satan's brought back up again, the Great White Throne Judgment, this final judgment, the dead are raised, there's a judgment, and then at the very end, so this is the very, very end, we have a description of this New Jerusalem. And the only specific reference to this term New Jerusalem is found in Revelation 21. So you can turn there with me. Revelation 21, and I'll read verses 1 to 4. And this is the first reference we get of this New Jerusalem. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of the heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And then in Revelation 21, 10 to 11, we get another specific reference to this New Jerusalem. Verse 10 says, And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain, and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, its radiance like a most rare jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal, And then John goes on to attempt to describe this city, and he uses the images of all these different types of precious jewels and stones, and he provides measurements for the city and various descriptions. So we see that this New Jerusalem, if we look at these the first few verses that I read, this New Jerusalem is heaven coming down to earth. It's heaven coming down to earth, and it's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, and this is where God's presence will find God's presence. Now, another passage that we need to quickly refer to is in Ezekiel. This is Ezekiel chapter 40, this is while the Israelites are in exile. Jerusalem and Solomon's temple have been destroyed. They're in exile, and Ezekiel receives a vision. So Ezekiel 40 verse 2 says, "In visions of God he brought me to the land of Israel and set me down on a very high mountain, on which was a structure like a city to the south." So very similar to what John was talking about, this idea that he's presented with a vision. He's placed on a high mountain and he sees the Jerusalem, this new city, and he goes into great detail about what this city will look like, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more later about what that specifically looks like. Now, the descriptions that we have of this New Jerusalem are few and far between. It's presented in a way that's quite vague. I mean, as visions tend to be in the Bible, then there's not a lot of specific description given to us in these visions, and I'm sure there's reason for that. But what this does lead to is perhaps a variety of interpretations as to what this New Jerusalem is and what it means. I did a little bit of digging into this, and it was quite interesting. And for the group so obviously for the Jews, we'll talk about what the Jews looked at more specifically a little bit later. But for the Jews, it was the idea they were in exile. This was going to be, Ezekiel's vision was of the new temple, the new city, and specifically the new temple that was going to be in Jerusalem after the exile. Now, the second city and temple that were constructed after the Israelites came back to Jerusalem does not meet the description found in Ezekiel. So what that leads a lot of Jews to believe is that this Ezekiel's vision refers to a temple that's yet to come, or a city that's yet to come, which does fit well with what Revelation talks about as well. It's a city that's yet to come. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later. The Jehovah's Witnesses discuss that this New Jerusalem is going to be a place where the 144,000 chosen by God will live and rule the earth, I guess, in a way. The Mormons believe that, obviously the Book of Mormon is all about this group of people that come to North America, the United States specifically, and set up a kingdom there. And they believed that there was a city or a town, I believe it was Independence, Missouri, and that was going to be where the New Jerusalem was going to be constructed. Obviously, that hasn't happened. And then we have, quite interestingly, and there's all sorts of stories about these New Jerusalem, but I thought this one was of particular interest, and this is a group of Anabaptists in 16th century Germany who were under great deals of persecution. They fled to a city called Munster, and it was predominantly a Catholic city at the time, but more and more of these Anabaptists had been going to the city of Munster to seek refuge. They eventually take over the city, and they declare that this is the New Jerusalem, and there's all sorts of prophecies about when Jesus is coming, how he's going to come down, and when Jesus comes down to earth, he's going to come to Munster, because that's this New Jerusalem. He's going to establish his kingdom there. Obviously, that didn't happen either. So there's a wide variety of interpretations as to what this New Jerusalem is. Now, in Revelation 21, which is where we're going to spend most of our time, it does provide a description to us of what this New Jerusalem will look like, though it's still quite vague. So where it's described as heaven on earth, and we see this marriage image. The New Jerusalem descends from heaven as a bride descending. So we get the image of a marriage of heaven and earth. Heaven and earth have been separated, and this is going to be the reunification of heaven and earth. It's going to be God's dwelling place with man. And we get also a description that death is going to be no more. And then Revelation 21:15-19, we get a description of the city, and I'll read that to you. And the one who spoke with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. The city lies 4 square, its length the same as its width. And he measured the city with his rod, 12,000 stadia. Its length and width and height are equal. He also measured its wall, 144 cubits by human measurement, which is also an angel's measurement. The wall was built of jasper, while the city was pure gold, clear as glass. The foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with every kind of jewel. The first was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, and the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth carnelian, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th crystalline phrase, and the 11th jacinth, the 12th amethyst, and the 12 gates were 12 pearls, each of the gates made of a single pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold, transparent as glass. So we get this specific description of the measurements, though the visuals we're presented with are still very vague. But we get the overall impression that this city is like nothing that we've seen before. I thought it would be of interest to you to get a little bit of a perspective here. I know that everyone likes visuals, so I have this globe here. So if we look at this globe, I looked at the scale, and it said that 3/4 of an inch equaled 500 miles. So if we go to Canada, I'm not sure if you can see it there. If we go to Canada, and then I've cut out a cube shape. So this shape would represent the measurements, roughly, that were presented with in Revelation 21. So that's what the measurements would look like, sort of. So you can see that it covers the vast majority of what is today Canada. So it's the idea of the city is enormous. It's almost beyond comprehension. Something that I found really interesting was the height of this city that's described in Revelation. It's a cube shape, and you may be wondering what that line is that I put on the cube. So that line would represent the orbit, the height of the orbit of many of our satellites. So basically, it's like a low Earth orbit, technically space. So that line would represent a low Earth orbit. Many of our satellites are there. So you can see that this city extends far into space, into what we would classify as space. It's for this reason that many Jehovah's Witnesses believe that this New Jerusalem is not going to be on Earth specifically, because it doesn't make a lot of sense because it's so tall and it extends into space. So they would argue that this city isn't actually going to be on Earth. It's going to be somewhere else. It's going to be in the heavens or whatever it may be. But I thought that was an interesting visual. Revelation 21, 22-27 gives us even further description of this city. And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. And the city has no need of sun nor moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives its light, and its lamp is the Lamb. By its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it, and its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. They will bring into it the glory and the honor of the nations, but nothing unclean will ever enter it, nor anyone who does what is detestable or false, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. So we get the picture of the city being, this utopia that for thousands of years people have dreamed about. This is God's presence on earth. It's Him making things right. One of the most interesting characteristics of the city is that there's no temple, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. But to Jewish eyes, this would have been very unfamiliar. The idea of this great city of God, but there's no temple. And if you pay any attention to the gospel message, we know why there's no temple, and it's because Jesus has provided for us a way to provide salvation through a relationship with Him. We no longer need the temple. We no longer need animal sacrifice for that. So there is no temple. God's presence permeates the entire city. We see this idea of all nations being gathered at this temple. We get the picture of the nations coming together and us living the way that God had originally intended. So what's the significance of this New Jerusalem? Why is it important? How do we dig a little bit deeper? And I mean, this is the culmination of the story of the Bible. The story of the Bible beginning in Genesis, where God has a plan for mankind, the Garden of Eden. There was a rejection of God by man, and a separation of God and man. There's separation of heaven and earth. So we really see that the Bible presents two spaces: an earthly space, a space where man exists, and in a space where God exists. And these two separate spaces are divided by sin. And what the story of the Bible is the struggle of man to find God. And we see that there are moments in the Old Testament where heaven and earth can overlap a little bit. And that overlapping in the Old Testament we described as the space in the tabernacle, and then the temple, and specifically the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies being the most holy space, in the space where God's presence resides. And often the Ark of the Covenant was kept here. And it's in this space that heaven and earth could overlap. But how is it that people could enter into the presence of God? Because of sin. Even if there's this overlapping, how could people enter into the Holy of Holies and into the presence of God? And that was through this whole system of animal sacrifice that we see in the Old Testament, where for the Israelites, their sin was put on the animal was slain, and the blood of the animal would wash them clean of their sin, and they could enter the presence of God for a short period of time, and then they'd have to do it again. Over and over and over, we get this system of animal sacrifice in the Old Testament to cleanse the people so they can enter into the presence of God. So we see that there's this overlapping through animal sacrifice and through the temple. Now, we're still separated, though. That's not how God intended it. God intended heaven and earth to be one. He didn't intend for the simple overlapping. And when we get the picture of Jesus, we see that Solomon's temple has been destroyed. There's a new temple that they're constructing, but this temple too is going to be destroyed. And for Jesus, He provides for us a way that we don't need that overlapping. We don't need the animal sacrifice anymore. We don't need to enter into this Holy of Holies. What He does is something incredibly unique, and that's He removes Himself from this heavenly realm and puts Himself onto the earthly realm. He enters into our realm, and in doing so, He meets us where we are, and then with His death on the cross as the perfect Lamb, He is able to provide for us the gift of salvation through relationship with Him. We get in John 1:29, John the Baptist says, "Behold the Lamb of the God who takes away the sin of the world." He was the perfect Lamb who took away the sin of the world. And so He entered into where we were and provided the gift of salvation to us. But even that isn't the end of the story of the Bible. We see that there is still sin. There's still a separation between heaven and earth. And it doesn't take us long to look around in the world throughout history and even now to recognize that sin is still prevalent in our society. We struggle with sin, and when we watch the news or whatever it may be, we see that the world still struggles with sin. So what we see is that this New Jerusalem is going to be the culmination of everything. God's going to make things the way that He intended them to be, where heaven can meet earth and they'll be one. So it's the culmination of the story. Revelation
21:1, we read about how there's a new heaven and a new earth. And Revelation 22 talks a little bit further about what that looks like. So if you look at Revelation 22, starting at verse 1, it says, "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, through the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations." So this is an obvious picture of the Garden of Eden. So this new Jerusalem is going to be like the Garden of Eden, like the world was intended to be, but it's not going to be the same as the Garden of Eden. No, it goes even further than that, because this is not just a garden, but a city, ruled and governed by God, where we can meet in His presence for all eternity. Now, we talked about how this city doesn't have a temple, which would have been a very unique feature, and how God's presence would be in this city. It wouldn't need the Holy of Holies to reside in. Now, when we look at the structure of the city, and I showed you the globe with the dimensions of the New Jerusalem on there, it really seems like an image that defies mathematics, the picture of this city. And there's all sorts of debate about if the city is literal, if John's description of the dimensions is literal, and I don't really want to get into that too much. That's maybe a conversation we can have for another day. But it is clear that what John is trying to do is hearken back to the Old Testament and provide for us a picture of what God's ultimate plan is. And if we look in Ezekiel chapter 40, and we were there earlier, in Ezekiel chapter 40, Ezekiel provides to us a series of descriptive measurements, just like John does. So John is hearkening back to the vision of Ezekiel, giving specific measurements. We see that in Ezekiel there are 12 gates, just like in John there's 12 gates. So we see another connection to Ezekiel's vision. One of the main differences, though, is that in Ezekiel's vision, he keeps talking about the temple. He keeps talking about how the descriptions he's giving, the measurements, and the precious jewels and everything that's going to be used to create this structure is a temple. So how do they coincide then? How can we recognize John's vision of this new Jerusalem? How can we reconcile that with Ezekiel's vision? Because Ezekiel says this is a temple. Well, the idea here is that this city is a temple. It doesn't have a temple at the center. The city is a temple. The entire city is a temple. And if we look at 1 Kings chapter 6, starting at verse 19, it says, "The inner sanctuary he prepared in the innermost part of the house, to set there the ark of the covenant of the Lord. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 20 cubits high, and he overlaid it with pure gold. He also overlaid an altar of cedar." In 1 Kings, this passage is describing the Holy of Holies, and we get the picture that this Holy of Holies, just like the description of Ezekiel, just like the description that John provides for us, this is a structure much like this cube shape. And the idea we get is that the measurements that John is giving to us of this cube, it's representing the fact that this city is the Holy of Holies. This city is the place that God is going to reside, and we can reside with him for eternity. So John is constantly making these connections back to the Old Testament, back to the Garden of Eden, back to the original structure of the temple, to show us that the New Jerusalem is the culmination of all of these things that we've read about in the Old Testament and the New Testament. This is God's creation made right, is the New Jerusalem. So the story of the Bible really is the rejection of God by man, the separation of God and man. Man's struggle to live on earth apart from God, and our struggle to seek him. It's about God's gift of redemption through Jesus and his gift of eternal life through relationship with him. The New Jerusalem is what closes the story. It's the end of the story. What closes the story is the world made right. Sin is gone. We are living in the constant presence of God in the New Jerusalem, whatever that might look like. It's the culmination of the story of the Bible. And I think that this is something to read about. So go to Revelation, the end of Revelation, and do some reading. It's very interesting reading. Go to the end of Revelation and read about this. I think it's especially important to read some of these things now, because what a great amount of hope this provides for us at a time where we see all sorts of frustration about this pandemic and the quarantines and all of these types of things. The fact that we haven't been meeting together as a church family for months. So we see all the frustration around that. We see the racial injustice that goes on, and the riots that are a part of that, and this yearning for justice in this world where we know that perfect justice cannot be attained. But we have this hope that in the future God has a plan to set the world right, that heaven will meet earth, God's presence will reside here with us, and we can live for eternity in this eternal kingdom that He's going to provide for us. So I hope that provides you some encouragement. We will continue to watch the news and updates from the church, and the hope would be that we can meet very soon. So thanks again for meeting with me, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.